Got.
Paul Wiseman, Fit to Print.
Thank you very much for joining the program here today. Of course, Fit to Print. Give us a little bit of a description of what that is. I know you from being active on social media with oil and gas content and news and that sort of thing. So, Fit to Print, give yourself a quick plug, sir.
Okay, well, I started off in 1995 writing advertorials for the Midland Reporter-Telegram. And during that time, part of what I did there was to write for the oil and gas industry. And so fast forward 20 years or so, I began to branch out and do some writing, not only of advertorials, but for other magazines, industry publications, and like the Permian Basin Oil and Gas magazine and some others. And so I've really focused now on writing not only in publications, but also doing advertising and that sort of thing for the oil and gas industry.
Talk to me a little bit about some of the trends that you've been seeing going on, because I totally understand the type of writing that you've done. And, it's a lot of 5,000-foot view and a lot of, specific micro as well. So when we look at what's going on in the pipeline right now, this is the big, story, the Atlantic pipeline, the Dominion, and I forget the other, Duke Energy. They decided to scrap that pipeline. Of course, the judge with the Dakota Access Pipeline put a halt on that. Major shockwaves totally through the pipeline industry. There's been a little bit of a trend for building pipelines, it seems. So this, to me, it's as almost like a reverse or a quick kind of a knee-jerk type of a thing. I know there's been an environmental movement, but talk to me about your observations, what you've seen when it comes to the pipelines, over the last several years and where we're at today.
Well, being in the Permian, it's sort of like being on an island, because pretty much everybody in the Permian agrees that we need to build pipelines. So when I look around at the rest of the world, or the rest of the United States, there are two problems with blocking pipelines. I mean, certainly we want them not to leak, and we want them to be safe and not pollute the waters. I mean, even the companies, or maybe especially the companies operating them, want that because that's product they can't sell, and they do want to be good stewards. But the two problems are, first of all, when you don't have a pipeline, you got to ship it somewhere else, some way else, and that's likely to be rail. Well, that's a whole lot more dangerous to truck, flammable liquids through downtown Minneapolis or whatever. And secondly, in the Northeast, that puts us to importing liquefied natural gas or something like that from Russia, which is known to be a huge polluter. So it seems backwards to me to continually block pipelines that are, nothing is perfect, but they're way ahead of what the alternative is.
Where I get a little bit confused is the rationale and the reason behind this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the judge stepped in because he wants more studies done for environmental purposes, correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay,
yes.
Okay, good. We're on the same page there. I haven't seen anything really discussed about the environmental impact, about the shift from pipeline to rails and cars. You brought up the rail part, but there's also the trucks and cars, if you will. Because at the end of the day, they're still going to move that stuff. I mean, the oil and gas companies have never been shy about, they're interested in results, and they're going to figure out a way to get the results. And if you're going to take away our pipeline, well, then we're going to have to give Warren Buffett a call and Matt Rose, and can you fire up the old rail cars that you invested $5 billion in 5 years ago? I mean, so there's backup plans is what I'm getting at, but it seems to me that shift would also have a shift in the environmental impact. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, we're definitely on the same page there, because that's what I was saying. That it's when you have oil or gas or natural gas liquids or whatever buried, under the ground. If something does go wrong, God forbid, then you've got a chance to contain that. If a rail car comes off the track, somebody runs a crossing signal and runs into it, man, you have a problem there. So, and it's more expensive. The trucks are being the most expensive because you've got one driver and a few barrels in there. For the train, you've got one engine and thousands of barrels. So the smaller the load, the more expensive it is to pay somebody to oversee that down the road. So you do end up with in an economy like this, you might end up with some production shut in, I suppose. In some, it might be the difference between making some fields profitable and not, or at least some wells.
I take a look at the agriculture issues right away. Up in North Dakota, we've got pulse crops. We've got, actually, I think North Dakota has got, 16 or 18 or something like that of the number one crop production in the United States, from, chickpeas to honey. So we rely on the rail a lot for hitting the ports, if you will. The last time I remember that the rail got an increase of transporting crude oil, the farmers got really upset. I mean, not upset at anybody, but they kind of felt like they were left out, like reprioritized, if you will. Have you looked at that, or are you familiar with what I'm talking about, how the ripple gets into the ag market about shipping the goods and services that the ag industry does?
Well, it's not directly, but it makes a lot of sense in supply and demand. If there's more demand on the rail system and it gets crowded, then prices are going to go up for everybody. And it's also going to slow down. I'm sure in agriculture, you have a narrow window to ship your products out before they spoil in the field or in storage or something. And if you're having to wait longer times for rail availability, then I'm sure that would be a problem. And that's going to raise food costs, and we're already with the COVID-19 stuff. I understand they're burying crops and burying animals and stuff like that already. So that would just be another strain on the food supply.
I'm looking at the release put out by Energy Transfer Partners, and they did mention this in their release. Farmers will suffer as crude transportation will move to rail, displacing corn, wheat, and soy crops that would normally be moved to market. Ironically, the counties along these rail lines will face increased environmental risks due to the increased amount of crude oil traveling by rail. There's another ironic twist in this whole environmental justification, to where now we're going to be, having these things moved by rail, and Energy Transfer Partners quick to point that out. So again, going back to the safety ramifications and the environmental responsibility, if you will, seems a bit odd that this happened so quickly and just out of nowhere. In fact, I was interviewing somebody, and I had a different news story that came out earlier that day about Energy Transfer implementing some force majeure clause, because they were like doubling down on the I guess they thought, everything was fine, and then all of a sudden, boom, came out of nowhere. So what have you heard from people in your network in terms of, do they feel this is going to impact them? You're down in Texas, so I don't know how much this is going to impact you guys, but if it's oil and gas, Texas is impacted. You know that.
Sure. And if I could step back real quickly to the last topic, just a little bit on agriculture, I had a thought there. What the agriculture is already strained from what I think are ridiculous requirements for turning corn into ethanol. So, that takes a whole lot of productive land out of food and all that to start with. So anyway, I did want to get back to that, but I mean, it makes it very difficult for investment money to go into these projects, because many of them, the Keystone pipeline and others, have been, a decade or more in the planning. And obviously, in the best case situation, it's going to be 3 to 5 years before you get a return on your investment. But when it stretches out and you get, if you had a checklist, we did A, B, C, and D, and now we get to have a pipeline, and you don't and so you do all that, and then suddenly there's a D, E, and F added after you've already, in that case, already built the pipeline and are running it. I can't imagine why anybody with unknown sudden risks like that would want to put tens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars into a project anymore. So that's gonna really put a damper on things. We have less of that in Texas, because the whole state basically the economy runs on oil and gas, but even there, in some areas there are some issues. But yeah, I mean, it's going to impact prices everywhere.
So I wanted to transition into an article that you sent me earlier this week about one of the topics we wanted to talk about, which was making the case for oil and gas, which is, let's look at some of the positives, some of the opportunities that exist out there, because I've been saying this whole time, they just printed $7 trillion and pumped it into the marketplace. Go get it. I mean, it's controlled and managed and this and that, but at the same time, there are opportunities out there. They're difficult to find. I'm not saying it's an easy time right now, and that's one of the reasons why I appreciate everybody that listens to the Crude Life, because we're out there actively looking for those positive investment opportunities out there. We had a great conversation yesterday about natural gas. Natural gas is one of the brightest spots right now. Crude oil is going through a little bit of a tough time right now, and coming off of this pipeline, that's a little bit of a devastation. But we just got done talking about how, geez, if you're in the rail car business or the trucking business, adequate opportunity for you there, part of the ebbs and flows of the economy. So with that being said, making the case for oil and gas, let's talk about that a little bit, because at the end of the day, 96% of what we use has fossil fuels, from our toothpaste to the toothbrush to the transportation it takes to get to the toothpaste to your house. So much of what we do does, fossil fuels. In our lifetime, it might decrease, but it ain't going away. So therefore, there's going to be ample times to kind of, find some opportunity. Let's talk about that today. You sent over the article, make the case for oil and gas. Let's do that a little bit. We just talked a little bit about some trucking and natural gas. Where do you see kind of some areas of positivity right now in the oil and gas sector, if I may be so bold?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think what you said is, where I'm calling you on my cell phone, which is mostly plastic and some rare earth. So that's more mining in there. So the misstatement, that's not the right word, but to say that we can do all that we do now without fossil fuels, with wind or whatever, is ridiculous. The reason that the number one fuel around the world is petroleum based, either gasoline or diesel, is it packs more energy than anything else. It's quickly restored. You can fill up in 5 minutes. A large truck might take 10, but it's the most efficient and the most useful fuel. And we're not going to be able to travel anywhere near like we do now, even if we were to. There's not enough lithium in the world for batteries to fill all these cars with. So there's just nothing that replaces oil and gas. And are there some things we can do to make it cleaner? Probably. And I think the changes, the positive for natural gas is the opportunities to generate electricity with it, replacing coal and I guess mainly coal. That's much cleaner. The U.S. has already dropped its emissions over the last 20 years by, I believe, don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think by more than any other industrialized nation, because of higher fuel efficiency added to cars and or required for cars, and then switching to natural gas. And there's still some things that you have to have coal for. Ironically, to make those wind turbines, the only thing that generates enough heat to forge that metal in the wind turbines is coal. So you can't even have so-called renewable energy without oil and gas and fossil fuels. And so I think there's what the problem is, that the radical environmentalists, and we all want a clean environment, but the radical environmentalists are not telling the whole story. They're making a wild pitch, and there are plenty of people that there are questions about whether climate change is as bad as advertised, and whether whatever climate change is happening is man generated, and that's a lot of the what's driving the environmental is that the climate change is going to kill all of us within the next 20 years. And the predictions that were made back in the 70s that New York was going to be underwater by 2020, those things didn't happen. So there's not a very good track record of predictions on what's happening there. So all that goes back to, we need to be good stewards of what we have, but using fossil fuels or doing away with all use of fossil fuels is not practical, and it's not necessary.
I think the media plays a big part of this, as well as the politicians, the elected leaders, even some of the organizations that are paid to promote the industry. I think that there's been a failure there to allow, the media has allowed some of the polarization to get to a point where it's just gotten ridiculous. Yeah, and the politicians have got caught up in I call it the pro wrestling of politics, because it's a contrived dance. I mean, instead of headlocks and arm bars, they use bullet points and sound bites. But each side, they know what they're doing, and it's like I say, it's a contrived dance, choreographed ballet, if you will. And a lot of the promotional organizations have become advocacy organizations. So they've just become kind of sub groups of the politicians and the interest behind that. And I think that has changed the industry to the tune to where, in fact, in the last interview I just did, we had a very nice organic conversation about how the industry has seemed to become reactive as opposed to proactive. For so long, they were proactive, and they've gotten reactive. And we organically came with the abandoned orphan well issue to where this is a real opportunity for industry to become proactive again. But there's so many things going on that a 16-year-old girl was going around the country saying fossil fuels are so bad that the industry got reactive to it. And then the new Green Deal came out, and the industry got reactive to that. So have you noticed that the industry has become a little bit more reactive instead of proactive? Or am I kind of just speaking out of school here?
I think there's some of both. I think one of the things that the people I talked to in that article in the magazine, one of them I talked to was Alex Epstein, who's got a book out and is a major force in that. He and some of the others said what we need to do is get out there like you are and like some of these other organizations are. I think most oil and gas producing states have advocacy groups. New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, Texas Oil and Gas, Permian Basin Oil and Gas Association, or Permian Basin Producers Association, excuse me. They'll be mad at me if I misquote them. But advocacy groups like this need, and the general public, we need to be active on social media, like I know you are and I am and others. That's where the battle is being fought at Twitter and Facebook in particular. And if we get out there and counter some of these wild, unfactual claims with fact, we can't make up stuff either. And sometimes, I'll be honest, I see that on the what I consider my side. I see stuff that's unsubstantiated on something that I would otherwise agree with, and we can't do that. We've got to keep our heads in the game and not fall prey to jumping on this sensational bandwagon. Make an emotional argument, sure. How would you like to freeze in your house? That's if you don't have adequate energy for heat, that's what could happen especially in North Dakota. But we've got to base that on the fact that renewables can't meet the energy needs of the United States. Plus, renewables don't make plastic for phones, for computers, for the dashboard of your car, for, as you said, like 96% of what you use is somehow one way or another connected with it. So I do see some people backing off, but I see others that are joining the fight, and we need more people joining the fight.
It's interesting to see how on Colorado, I've kind of deemed it regulations gone wild. I mean they're putting soundproof walls around the different rigs and wells and things like that. And it just seems like there's so many different. It's kind of the test state, I guess, for a lot of oil and gas regulations. But the thing I have seen at the bright spot is the natural gas. Planet of the Humans. I'd watched that movie, the documentary, the Michael Moore documentary, which he's not in, by the way. Anybody who hasn't seen it yet, Michael Moore is not in it. He just uses his name, and it's kind of I related to it very much because when I started this, I was gonna investigate against oil and gas because I was gonna go do my own thing, be an independent writer, and go and I had a couple magazines that were gonna publish my stuff. I had some newspapers, I had a radio show, I had I had podcasts back in the day, whatever you want to call it, and I saw very quickly that my initial bias was wrong. And the oil and gas industry was not the bad guys like the media portrayed them to be. And so I completely changed my tune. And that's how I felt the Planet of the Humans was, where it had activists, environmentalists that realized that, wow, things are really not the way that I thought they were. And so went and investigated their own. And the part of that movie that I thought was so fantastic was, it talked about some of the greed that is involved, but it said that natural gas isn't going anywhere. It's that, is that, hey guys, you can say whatever you want about crude oil or coal, but natural gas ain't going anywhere. If you want wind turbines and if you want Tesla cars and you want a cell phone, you better get used to natural gas sticking around. So that's what I took away from it. How about you?
To be honest, I didn't watch it all the way through, but he did point out, I did get far enough to see how where he talked about how much oil and gas, how much of a part it plays in like these solar plants, the ones that use focused sunlight to create steam. Well, how do they start that? Well, first thing in the morning, they fire up the gas boiler.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned the coal, and that's actually what I saw happening to coal. I thought coal would figure out a way to desalinize water in the ocean, and it would be used more towards that. And Alex Epstein, I believe he pointed out in his book, and I know the Rockefeller Foundation has pointed this out. Humans have been decarbonizing for 150 years naturally, long before the Sierra Club came along. We've been decarbonizing. We started with wood and hay, and then went to coal, and then to crude oil and natural gas, and slowly trying to figure out some other things that work. And if you take a look at the hydrocarbons and the dirty carbon molecules, if you will, they've been decreasing every time to where I think there's just a couple now with natural gas. So it's been going on for a long time. And this crash course that we have to somehow change our way of life overnight just seems so bizarre to me. It's that extreme polarization that just is enabled out there that just seems so bizarre to me. But anyway, that's my 2 cents on that.
Well, and speaking of the environmental, the thing that in 1901 the Spindletop gusher came in January of 1901, and that ushered in an era where people realized that oil was plentiful, they could use it for stuff. And the number one thing, well, I don't know about number one, a key part of that was they stopped killing whales for their oil. Many thousands of whales were killed mainly for their oil to use in oil lamps in homes. And when with oil, then they were able to shift to fuel oil, to kerosene, and that sort of thing. That was the first wave, as you're talking about, and not only decarbonization, but of keeping whales from becoming extinct. I know some of them are still endangered, and there's still people out there poaching and all that, but the mass killing of them was done away with by the availability of kerosene for lighting homes. As you say, that's been going on in a number of different ways for 150 years, and the coal fires in London during the late 1800s, London was almost unlivable because of the pollution from coal in those days. So even using the more polluting fuels, at least to capture them and put them in a certain small area where not everybody's using them. But with coal-fired generation, you can at least have a chance to scrub that than when you put it in one confined area. And so even switching to electricity with coal, like, sort of helped that some. And I know there's still efforts to clean up coal even more if they can make that economical. So I don't want to bash coal, even though it's a harder one to justify in this day and age, but I think even it still has some use if it's done right.
Well, I do too, and that's the thing about coal is I think it just needs to be reinvented and repurposed because it's a very useful commodity. It's probably the most reliable source for energy and heat, etc. But like I said, there's a lot of other properties that coal has, from from filtration to you mentioned in the wind turbines, but also in solar panels. It's used in solar panels too. So I'm looking at the solar and wind and everything along those lines, and I take a look at the last 40 years, and they've had major subsidies and they haven't hit their milestones. And I've seen kind of this crash course of trying to get off of fossil fuels. It's so bizarre how as soon as the masters of the marketplace kind of came in and started trying to play, video games and board games with the economy, that really seemed to take away from the natural evolution of energy in my mind. That might be a little bit too hippy dippy talk, but it certainly seems like just, I get a little bit irritated because if they would shift a certain amount of those subsidies away from wind and solar to natural gas, I think they could solve that flaring problem overnight. I mean, like within a year, they could probably solve it because that would allow a nice stimulus into the research and development wing of the the natural gas area, and I just think it would do wonders. But it turns into politics because all of a sudden now you're against renewable energy. It's like, no, I'm kind of just for accountability. That's all.
Yeah.
And I'd like to know your thoughts on that, about the flaring natural gas and figuring out a way to really solve that issue, because to me it's very solvable. Very solvable.
Well, there are a number of things. The first thing to do, as you said, would be to, as we talked about earlier, to allow pipelines to be built. And it's true, the number I've heard that in Texas, particularly in the Permian, which last year became the most prolific basin in the entire world, surpassing the big field in Saudi Arabia. Now, what will happen to it, with all this going on, I don't know. It may drop down. But we were flaring enough natural gas each day, flaring enough to generate electricity to light every home in the state of Texas. It was every day. It was just going up and not even smoke. So that is a problem, and it's something that the Texas Railroad Commission, which, if you're not from Texas, you'd say, why does the Railroad Commission have anything to do with oil and gas? Well, it has to do with what we were talking about earlier, that in the old days, oil was shipped through rail cars. And so the Railroad Commission, all it does now, it has nothing to do with transportation, all it does is control oil and gas, but they were allowing permits for wells. They're supposed to, I'm going to get way off into something that I'm not an expert in here, but there are rules about how long you can flare gas waiting for a well to be connected to a pipeline. And with the pipelines being basically full, they were kind of waiving those restrictions. It was like 30 days. But in the Permian, oil is the main thing. Natural gas, for a lot of people, is basically a nuisance. They make their money off the oil and gas, and off of oil, and gas is a byproduct. So it hasn't had a high priority. But that's one of those things where there are other ways to deal with that. There are companies that sell compressors that run off of produced natural gas, and some of the challenge there is that not all natural gas is pure. Some of it has a lot of nitrogen, and some of it has some helium in it, some other things. So you have to have something that will work on a wide range of BTU density. But you'd have to have a whole lot of those out there to make up for the BTUs that are going up in that. So the number one thing to do is to allow pipelines to be built and generate electricity or be exported through LNG, which there are some challenges with those markets right now because of the COVID situation. But
I don't know. I take a look at some of these crazy capitalists out there that are mining Bitcoin with flared gas, and you got other ones turning into gas on site. And I always give the example of, who knows, we could probably invent some super plastic, and pretty soon everybody can get a pool in their backyard for $1,000 because the mold is some sort of super plastic. I don't know. I'm just throwing a few things out there to where the pipelines work, and the pipelines are the safest, but they're not the 100%. I'm talking about the 20, 10% of the wells that they don't get to the pipes. They're too remote for whatever reason or whatever the case might be.
Or they don't have enough production to make it worth
yeah,
building a pipeline.
Right, exactly. There's always a reason on some of them. But it's interesting because what's happening in like Lake Charles over in Louisiana, you take, Europe, which, they're paying 15, 16, 17, $18 for natural gas. We're paying what, $3 minus in some days. China's paying about $8. And what's happening, I think it was a French company that is building a natural gas processing plant because it's cheaper to get the gas, put it in Lake Charles, and ship it over to France than it is to buy it. It's just...
Yeah, in fact, you're quoting some prices. I pulled up some prices this morning. Actually, it's about $1.50 per million BTUs this morning, and at the Waha hub out by Pecos in West Texas, it's less than $1. And some of that's because the pipelines are still jammed. There have been some new ones open up, and production has dropped a little bit, but there's still that's really cheap. So I can imagine, that it would be cheaper to send it overseas.
Well, totally. And when I heard that, it blew my mind. But as soon as I heard that, it instantly made sense, just off of simple fourth grade math. So anyway, but so talk to me a little bit about what's going on in your neck of the woods. Are you still down in Midland?
Well, at the moment, I am actually. You were talking about Lake Charles. At this moment, I am on the North Shore with some family stuff. So it's all good. But so since I've officed at home since 1995 as a freelance writer and all that, so I can basically work wherever I need to be. So that's quite different from this coastal area is quite different from the Permian, where it never rains. Here it rains almost every day. And but it's also an oil and gas area here, so it's a lot of familiar territory.
Yeah, there's Louisiana had a lot of economic activity, a lot of building, like you said, down in that Lake Charles area. And then, of course, Texas had a lot in the Corpus Christi area as well, as they were ramping up their ports, getting ready for a lot of exporting, without a doubt. And so I got to revisit some of those stories to find out just if it's still going on or not. But it's, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of building. The Port of Corpus Christi is one that's really ramping up for that. Their point is that the Port of Houston is mostly most of what goes there is already going to refineries up and down that part of the coast. And Corpus doesn't have. I think they may have one or two small refineries there, but they're ramping up for exports, especially for those the very large crude carriers, the VLCCs, and in Louisiana, they're Loop, Louisiana Offshore. I forget exactly what that stands for, but the Loop port used to be for import, and they're in the process of switching it to export. And I've been told that up to 50% of the oil and gas produced in the Permian goes for export nowadays.
Really?
That's a pretty scary number when you realize that right now exports are down. Yeah. So that it was illegal to export domestically produced oil until late 2015. It was a law that had been passed in the late 70s when we had those Arab oil, what they called Arab oil embargo times, and so we decided we weren't going to export any of ours. We're going to save it all here. Well, as the market changed, 40 years later or more, then that was rescinded in late 2015. So in 2016, we began exporting oil and gas.
By the way, do you remember when that happened in 2015?
Yes.
Do you remember how ridiculous it got? There's a great example of how stupid politics gets, because it was down to a technicality of certain, I mean, it was so weird. Had to do with how they loaded it or a certain amount of sulfur. And anyway, it was plain politics with oil, so they could send it out. And then they just are like, okay, we got to update this thing. It was ridiculous.
Well, oil is always politics. I mean, it's political survival. It's why in right before World War II started, that's why the Germans wanted Czechoslovakia. They didn't care about the Sudetenland. They cared about it because it had oil. The Japanese attacked the Philippines because it had oil.
Well, that was the argument for Afghanistan, was lithium. That was the big conspiracy behind that, I guess.
The Kuwait war in 1992. If that was just a little desert country over there, nobody would have cared who took it over.
Yeah, that's right. And so much of the economy is oil and gas. I mean, whether it's the military that's protecting the oil and gas reserves, or whether it's the oil and gas refineries that need us to get our goods and services to the market, that type of thing. There's a lot to be said about energy is the economy, really. There's a lot to be said about that. And I don't feel bad saying that, to be honest.
Well, yeah, I mean, energy, well before there was any oil and gas, why did they, back in ancient times, why did the Babylonians and the Assyrians conquer all the surrounding territory? So they could use their people for forced labor. That was energy.
Yeah. No, it's true. And, a lot of the reasons why the gold and silver and copper and platinum and palladium carry their intrinsic value through the years is because it's a good conductor of electricity. And when you take a look at your iPhone and you take a look at the nuclear bombs and et cetera, they need silver and gold for the wiring because the energy is so intense. But it's malleable, and it's a very good conductor. Copper is kind of the entry level. They found copper clay pot batteries in the Egyptian tombs. So they were understanding the power of copper and storage of energy back in those days. So now we're getting in the hippy dippy. Folks, this is what happens when you get a couple writers on the line. Because by the way, I'm a writer by trade. That's how I first got into the media. I'm actually a writer. I just do this podcast and radio stuff to pay the bills because nobody pays us writers anymore. So you gotta stay creative. But we should probably give you another plug so you can get your bills paid. So people do pay you for your writing. So
that's the plan.
See, exactly. That's the point there, folks. But have you got a website, or how can people get in touch with you if they want to contract you out for some writing services or et cetera?
Sure. My website, my company is Fit to Print, but that as a web address is already taken. So my website's under my name. It's paulmwiseman.com. M is in Michael, my middle name, so it's paulmwiseman.com. And I have an email address set up there, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I get on Twitter every now and then, but I don't look for me there because I'm not on it that often. I probably should be, but I can only keep up with so much at a time. But this conversation, when you're dealing with two writers, you're also dealing with two people that read. So that's I tell people I know a little bit about a whole lot of stuff, but I'm inch deep and 10 miles wide. But I have been fortunate enough to write for a lot of different areas of oil and gas industry. So I know a little bit about exports, a little bit about pipelines and upstream and that sort of thing. So it makes I can get into a conversation with almost anybody. Usually, this is different for me because I'm the one asking the questions. So I'm on a different side of the interview situation this time.
It's bizarre. Every Friday I do a interview with Black Hills Wyoming Radio, and we'll go. I'll talk for 15 straight minutes sometimes, and because I'm not used to being able to talk. I'm used to just being able to ask the questions, and even those I get a little long-winded, but I'm trying to do more of a conversational interview as my style, like a Charlie Rose, or that. I suppose that's after the Me Too generation. It can't say Charlie Rose anymore. So whoever the modern day one is, I guess. Hey, it's open. If anybody's listening, I'll take that job, I guess. What the heck? I love good oak table conversations. You know what I mean? Just it's no judgment on the table here. We're just gonna flesh out and flush out depending on which dialect you want to have. It's flesh out, by the way. That's the old version of it. Of a topic, because it's great stuff. So we'd like to have you back to make sure we can talk about some other things. But what are you working on right now? And I'll just give you kind of the final word so you can talk about whatever you'd like. I like to let guests kind of have the final word. That way the question isn't framed by me. So the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you. Well, there's some things that I can't talk about because of I have confidentiality stuff, but I'm working on some let's see. Boy, I'm on the spot here. Now I got to think fast. I've done some writing for a British publication called Tank Storage Magazine. I've got an article in the one that just came out there, and I'm planning to do another one for them in the fall. That's where I learn about tankers and stuff like that. But I'm also working on one for the Permian Basin Oil and Gas Magazine about environmental. So we talked about environmental stuff. This one will be about environmental companies that do cleanups and compliance and stuff like that. And another one on drones. And that's a fun topic. Once that one comes out, I can kind of give you some information on that. There's a lot of new stuff happening with drones.